Welcome to the Color of Success podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Huang. Many of us are feeling a wide range of emotions: sadness, anger, fear, sometimes hopelessness and helplessness. This season, we will be exploring all the feelings and ways to empower each other to take action. So, let's go. Game on. Zhengyu Huang is the former president of the Committee of 100, a nonprofit of prominent Chinese Americans dedicated to advancing constructive U.S.-China relations and promoting Chinese American inclusion. Born in Shanghai and raised in Los Angeles, Huang holds degrees in industrial engineering, economics, and computer science from Stanford and an MBA from Harvard. He began his career at Intel, where he led negotiations with the Chinese government on IP and 4G partnerships. He later served as a White House fellow under President Obama, founded a financial technology firm in Shanghai, and now leads an education-focused investment firm investing in the U.S. A best-selling author of 4 books, Huang's talks have reached over 50 million people. His new book is Rethinking China, Challenging Our Economic Assumptions and Opportunities for Lasting Prosperity.
My full name is Zhang Wang, but my friends call me Z, like the letter.
Yes, and we're friends already. So, Z, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
My pleasure.
Well, we are going to be talking about your new book, Rethinking China, Challenging Our Economic Assumptions and Opportunities for Lasting Prosperity. And I started diving into the book and I was like, okay, I definitely want to talk about this. I have to put out a disclaimer. This is not on government time. This is personal opinions that Z and I are going to be sharing and going back and forth about. So what inspired you to write this book, first of all?
Great. I became president of a nonprofit called Committee of 100. And it was the second day of the COVID lockdowns. And by the way, the Committee of 100 was started more than 30 plus years ago at the urging of Henry Kissinger. He was very good friends with I.M. Pei, the noted architect. And over dinner one night in New York City, Kissinger said to I.M., hey, U.S.-China relations is on the up and up, and Chinese Americans, you guys should play a more active role. So I.M. got together a few other noted Chinese Americans, including Yo-Yo Ma and a few others, and they started this nonprofit organization dedicated to 2 key missions. One is Chinese American inclusion in America and a more productive U.S.-China relationship. The organization is a member-based organization, has about 130 members, all American citizens of Chinese descent. Members that folks probably know include Jerry Yang, who founder of Yahoo, Eric Yuan, founder of Zoom that we're using, Gary Locke, who used to be ambassador to China and governor of Washington State, amongst others. I was, privileged to be president for 4 years. And as I alluded to, my second day as president, there was a COVID lockdown. And as many of us remember, because of the rhetoric that a lot of our political leaders used at the time, there was a huge rise in anti-Asian hate and violence. So immediately, I was thrown into kind of this intersection between civil liberties and national security. For 4 years, I worked closely with both the Biden and Trump administration at the White House, State Department, Department of Justice, the FBI, and both aisles of Congress, advocating that we can safeguard our national security while protecting our civil liberties. Because it was very clear with the deterioration in U.S.-China relations, Chinese Americans, and by extension, Asian Americans, which many people can tell us apart, we are caught between a rock and a hard place. And so in many ways, we have to speak up for our rights. And also in many ways, we have to get involved and understand, what's going on between this relationship and what role do Chinese Americans and Asian Americans have to play in probably the most consequential bilateral relationship of our generation and perhaps of this century.
So walk me through it because, obviously you're able to work collaboratively with both administrations. And so was there overlap, differences in terms of how folks responded based on, who you were working with?
Oh, absolutely. Look, the first thing I did was, thanks to the general support of some of our members, we actually spent about $1 million working with the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is kind of the research unit of the magazine that we all know as The Economist, to create a volume report on the contribution of Chinese Americans for the last 175 years. We call it From Foundations to Frontiers, right? Tracing the origin of Chinese Americans in America and the contributions we made. Because one key thing we really wanted to make clear that we have been instrumental to the making of this country.
Absolutely.
And that this country is successful because of the contributions. And even though Chinese Americans, as you probably know from history, we have been the only ethnicity that was specifically barred from the United States due to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 for about 63 years. Even though we've been specifically excluded, that the more this country included us, the more it has benefited from the contribution of Chinese Americans. And by the way, we are not unique in that, right? And this story applies to other ethnicities who have made America a home. But, we just haven't done systematic analysis of the contribution of Chinese Americans.
That's what I love about the book. It does look at data. And before we jump into some of that data, I wanted to first address, because a lot of people would give you the data and at the same time they're like, leave my name out of it.
Exactly.
What was your experience of that, and how does that intersect with our culture?
Yeah, well, twofold, right? And first, I want to answer by saying, through this process, I've realized most Americans never been to China. How Americans perceive China, we can see a lot of it by how Americans perceive the Chinese living in America.
Yeah.
And despite being here for 175 years, most of us still labor under, these stereotypes that continue to haunt and plague our people, including the perpetual foreigner, including the dual loyalty, and including being the yellow peril, right? These are these unspoken tropes that still cloud not just the judgment of domestic policy, but increasingly foreign policy, because we're seeing that, these words being used. And in the book, I also trace this on how words have meaning, and these words are being used to describe, U.S.-China relations, but also how the Chinese are perceived, and subsequently how the Chinese are perceived in America. By the way, we work closely with the Biden administration. This is one difference, right? The Trump administration was not as open to work on this, but the Biden administration was on what we call anti-Asian hate and violence language guide, so that government officials are more mindful of this when they're talking about U.S.-China relations, and also kind of a diplomatic language guide, so that we don't automatically revert to these century-old tropes when we're talking about foreign policy, right? Again, look, U.S. government has real quarrels with the Chinese government, but it's not about the people, right? We should never ascribe certain characteristics to a people, just like we don't do with any other people. So that's kind of one key thing. And then another thing is, obviously, with the Trump administration, one of the key things we had to do was, showcase. And again, this is why we did, the report, is really to showcase the unique contribution, immense contributions we have made to this country. And Stephanie, I have to tell you, until I did that, I just did not know how much we did, not just in places like we know, for example, about 40% of all startup founders in Silicon Valley are ethnic Chinese, or, out of, even though we're about 1+% of the population, 6-7% of, the healthcare industry are Asian or Chinese Americans, right? That's stuff that people know. But what I did not know is almost 20% of all eligible men, Chinese American men, served in the U.S. Army during World War II. And even today in national security, we're probably 6-7% of people who work in that in public service compared to our population ratio, right? We have made contributions in all these areas, and even in the cultural space, we made so much contributions that are just not talked about, right? But once you dig into it, we're like, wow, America is really an amalgamation, and we have played a critical role. And so that's something we really indexed on when we were in the Trump administration, to make them understand that, we're unique assets. And this is something I've said in many media interviews when I was president. I said, we're not a national security liability, right? Don't look at us and think of us as spies. No, we are a national security asset. We are loyal American citizens who also have a unique understanding and appreciation of China. So whether if China is competitor or foe, you want Americans who truly understand the other in order to actually be able to compete. Whether you collaborate or compete, you want Americans who truly understand the other. And the Chinese Americans are best suited to do that. And that's something that, I really believe in. And I think that's something that, our community has an ability to showcase over and over again.
You mentioned a lot of policies, obviously China's Exclusion Act, et cetera. What do you think continues to perpetuate this idea that China is 100% a foe? Because I think one of the data points that you said was that the myth was that China steals $600 billion in intellectual property each year.
Yeah.
What plays into that without, not even having the data in front of folks?
Yeah, great question, Stephanie. So first of all, I want to be clear. China is a threat, right? The question is not whether China is a threat. The question is, what kind of threat is China? To borrow an analogy from meteorology, if it's Category 5 hurricane, well, you better get in your car and get out of Dodge. But if it's Category 1, you close your windows and you just sit at home. Right? Today, because of the hysteria over China, everything is seen as Category 5. Therefore, our reactions become unmeasured and disproportionate, and many times hurting our own interests and our own values. And that was one of my key findings from the book. And by the way, during those 4 years and a year and a half thereafter, I spoke to about 300 of the leading scholars on U.S.-China. These including leading experts. These include current and former government officials, think tank leaders, academic scholars, business leaders, etc. And I have to tell you, almost all of the assumptions that underpin U.S.-China relations today, I found based on the data and the evidence they provided me, almost all of them were misleading, and some of them patently false. And let me further by stating that, make no mistake, we are at war with China today. We're engaged in a tech war, in a trade war, in a currency war, in a media war, in a tariff war, and if most experts, are correct, we're also engaged in a proxy war in Ukraine and possibly in Iran. Right? The only war we're not engaged in is a kinetic war, an armed conflict between the world's two largest economies, each with nuclear weapons that can reach and devastate the other. So my position is we must be prepared for war, but we better be sure that the assumptions that would drive us to war are correct, because the consequences are devastating if we're wrong. And U.S.-China history relations is very interesting. In 1972, the two countries normalized, and for the next 40 years, the two countries enjoyed unprecedented engagement. But about 10 years ago, that strategic position fundamentally pivoted from engagement to confrontation and competition. And one of the key focuses for my book is to say, it's been 10 years, right? There's enough data and evidence to say whether if that strategic pivot and the policies that emanated from that pivot have made Americans more economically competitive, nationally secure, and have advanced our values. Because and no matter if you're Republican or Democrat, I think as Americans, we all agree we want policies that make us more nationally secure, more economically competitive, and advance our values. And I have yet to find anybody that has said the policies on China in the last 10 years have done that, right? So it was quite astounding. And let me tie it back. This is a little long-winded answer, but let me tie it back to your question or your comment about the 600 billion number, right? The $600 billion of IP stolen from China was a number that was used by the president and many other leading politicians. And I'm going to skip to why that number, because I spoke to all these experts and said, because I'm an engineer by training, I want to know numbers. And that number is a big number. And I went through all the experts to find out where that number came from. Turns out that's a made up number. But because we believed in that number, in 2008, the Department of Justice started the China Initiative, the only initiative in the department's history targeted towards one specific country, right? Because obviously, $600 billion stolen every year, that must beg an incredibly large spy network in the United States, right? Otherwise, how do you steal $600 billion a year? And so guess who they focused on? They focused on Chinese American academics, because for 40 years, they were encouraged to engage with Chinese universities by their own American universities because of their language and cultural capabilities. And they publish all of that and make all of that public. So that's why in 2008, then FBI director also said, every 10 hours, we're opening up a China-related case. And so thousands of Chinese American academics were ensnared in the China Initiative. Thousands of people, their lives were ruined. By the way, at the end of all this, the MIT Tech Review did an analysis of all China Initiative cases, all of them, and found, Stephanie, zero, let me repeat, zero cases related to economic espionage. Almost all of those cases fell apart because of shoddy evidence, but their lives were ruined, right? Many of them, because the universities get funding from the government, as soon as the FBI investigates you, they suspend you or they fire you, right? And then imagine mounting a legal defense against the US government. It costs millions of dollars. I've spoken to many of these professors because at Committee of 100, we work closely with them. I mean, they just say, their lives were completely ruined. Nobody wanted to be their friends anymore because they thought, well, if the FBI investigates you, you must be a China spy, right? And even when their names are cleared, many of them never get their lives back. And the sad thing is, many of them decided to just leave the United States. And so the United States, during this time when talent is most needed, have done a wonderful job of driving away some of our best talents to quote unquote our top competitor, because we operated under these made up erroneous numbers that ultimately ended up hurting not just our own interests, but also our own values. And I can go on and on, Stephanie. We did Committee of 100 under my leadership. We did an analysis of all economic espionage cases since 1996, right? 1996 was when Congress passed this act specifically to target economic espionage cases. And we found that all economic espionage cases analyzed, even at the height of the China hysteria, less than half of them had anything to do with China, meaning more than half of them had nothing to do with China. But with the China related cases, we found that if you had a Chinese surname, almost a third of them, basically their cases were later overturned, or vindicated, meaning at least a third of them were falsely accused, at least. And of the ones that ended up getting sentences, if you have a Chinese surname, your sentences were more than twice as long than if you had a Western surname. You get handcuffed and paraded on the perp walk at 80%, whereas a majority of others without a Chinese surname basically just get a summon and you turn yourself in at the police station, right? And these numbers go on and on. That's why when I was there, we actually worked with our congressional allies to hold a congressional roundtable. And check this out. The name of it was called Researching Wild Chinese. because that was a real thing. I mean, and today, and if you look it up, if you just search Wall Street Journals and New York Times, you found that thousands of Chinese academics have left the United States because of the China Initiative and other things that have happened. And unfortunately, we are really shooting ourselves in the foot. In this competition, global competition for talent, not only are we not attracting the world's best talents, including from China, we're actively driving them away. And so, that's just one clear example of, what these policies, unfortunate policies, have done to our own national interest.
And I mean, to be honest, it's really hard. I was born and raised in San Francisco, and so I get that mindset. I get why people are fleeing because they're not appreciated versus, and even obviously defamed at that point, and their lives are ruined. So I could completely understand why. And so I know you were trying to present a lot of the data and wanted to stay away kind of for more recommendations. However, I think we're in a time now where we need some solid voices that have done the research to say, well, what do we do, Z? Because it can really get people down mentally to be pessimistic, cynical, etc., and just be like, I'm not going to contribute. I'm not going to be a startup founder or,
Yeah.
Academic or whatnot.
Yeah. No, great point, Stephanie. I say all this, but in the I do have to say this was a meeting I had with a senior official in the Trump administration, and he said something I remember. He said, I believe, Mr. Huang, we are different from China and any other country in that we are not perfect. America is certainly not perfect. Look at our history. We made a lot of mistakes, but we always try to do better, right? I am very bullish about America. The truth is, I came here when I was 10. I'm able to do everything I was able to do because of the opportunities afforded me by this country. I'm very grateful for this country. I'm very bullish about this country. I think we can outcompete against China and any other competitor by doing what we do best, by going back to what makes America special, right? By attracting the world's best talent, by allowing them to make a home from this country. Each of them come from different places. All of us may come from different places, but we've all made this our home. And we made this a better home for all of us, right? By combining our talents and all of our expertise. And I think that's what makes us special. I think, unfortunately, maybe we lost a little bit track of that. And if we can go back to that, I just have so much confidence, in America. And then one thing I do think, in America, there is an ability to speak truth to power. Look, when I wrote this book, I had quite a few very senior Chinese Americans that said, Z, don't do this, right? I mean, look, already a lot of people are under suspicion. You do this, you raise issues, you're going to be under suspicion, even if you don't do anything wrong, right? Stay under the radar. And the thing that compelled me to do this and to provide the evidence and the data so that everybody could just take a look and make your own decision is because I truly believe the American experiment. I believe that if we all come together and try to make this country better, this country will be better because, ultimately, this country works for us. The government works for us. We are the taxpayers. If there is a war, we're the ones who pay for it. And, it's probably our friends and our siblings who will have to fight for it. So I think we have the right to speak up for it. And, I also remember a congressman from Texas who said something really powerfully that I always remember. He said, look, and he's African-American. He said, look, we learned during the civil rights movement that, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And today, especially when it comes to U.S.-China, relations and U.S.-China policy discussions, Chinese Americans and Asian Americans are generally not at the table, right? And unfortunately, if we're not at the table, we could be on the menu. And so I urge, all of our friends in the community, to get engaged because we know that all foreign policy is still domestic policy at heart. And this is, one of my key findings from the book is a lot of these foreign policies ended up to be domestic policy. And so, if it has to do with us, we have a right to speak up. And this is something that we do need to speak up, because we remember what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, right? If we don't speak up now and things get bad, I tell my friends why I speak up is, I can't go back to China. If I go back to China, they'll be like, oh, you're American. You're from America. You have American passport. And here, this is home for me. So I better fight for my home, right? I better fight for, what I believe in here. And I think our community, where Chinese Americans were 5 million strong, but Asian Americans were 20 million strong. We're still a minority, but we got a strong voice. And I think together we got a really strong and powerful voice.
Absolutely. Well, Z, any other food for thought that you wanted to give our audience?
Well, again, I encourage everybody to learn more. Feel free to buy a book. If not, you can go to rethinkingchina.us. That's the website, rethinkingchina.us. You get a lot of free information. You can download the first chapter, right? For me to write the book it's really, I have no interest of making money. It's really to just, get the word out, share the data and evidence so that for Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, we can speak intelligently about this issue that affects our community deeply and not feel like we have to hide, and be very proud of all the contributions we made to this country, and know that our contribution in this area is actually for the good of the country. And again, I thank you for all the great things you're doing, and keep on doing that. And yeah, it's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Z.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening. We would love for you to subscribe to the podcast and join our community on all our socials at colorsuccesspodcast.com. Looking forward to you checking out my memoir, Cancel the Filter, Realities of a Psychologist, Podcaster, and Working Mother of Color on Amazon and wherever books are sold. I'd love to hear your Cancel the Filter moments.